They found the envelope on a Tuesday morning. Jody Stubblefield, Clyde's wife, stood in their small Madison kitchen holding an envelope that shouldn't exist. Inside was a cashier's check for an amount that made her knees weak. No letter, no explanation. Just numbers that could mean the difference between life and death for her husband, the man whose drumming had literally changed music history. Someone knew. Someone cared. But who? For 3 years, that question haunted the Stubblefield household. Jody called the bank 17 times. She contacted journalists, lawyers, anyone who might help trace the phantom benefactor. Every door closed. Every lead evaporated. The donor had covered their tracks with the precision of someone who'd done this before. Someone who understood that true generosity demanded anonymity. And somewhere in Minnesota, inside a purple fortress called Paisley Park, a man with platform heels and a guitar smiled, knowing he'd just repaid a debt the music industry never acknowledged. A debt written in funk, sealed in silence, delivered in grace. Before we continue with this remarkable story, consider subscribing to hear more untold stories that reveal the hidden humanity behind music's greatest legends. To understand what happened in that Madison kitchen in 2000, you have to go back to 1969, to a recording studio in Cincinnati where James Brown was cutting tracks for what would become one of the most influential albums in funk history. The session was routine until Brown called for a drum solo. What happened next would echo through 5 decades of music, touching everything from hip-hop to electronic dance music, from pop to rock. Clyde Stubblefield sat behind his kit and played 7 seconds that would change everything. Just 7 seconds. A drum break so perfect, so precisely funky, so impossible to replicate that it became known simply as the funky drummer. But here's what they don't tell you about creating something timeless. Immortality doesn't pay the bills. When Funky Drummer was recorded, Clyde was a session musician earning union scale. Maybe $60 for the day. No royalties, no publishing rights, no ownership of the 7 seconds that would define his legacy. James Brown owned the recording. The label owned the rights. And Clyde owned nothing but the memory of playing something extraordinary. By 1986, when hip-hop producers discovered the break and began sampling it, Clyde was playing weekend gigs at grocery store openings in Madison, Wisconsin, while Public Enemy built Fight the Power on his drums, while NWA crafted Straight Outta Compton using his beat, while LL Cool J and Run DMC and dozens of other artists constructed platinum records on the foundation of those 7 seconds, Clyde was struggling to make rent. The math was simple and devastating. His drum break had been sampled over 700 times by 1990, generating hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. Clyde's share? 0. Prince understood this mathematics better than most. He'd spent his entire career fighting for ownership, for control, for the right to profit from his own genius. He knew what it meant to watch others build empires on your foundation. But more than that, Prince understood something deeper about Clyde's contribution. As a drummer himself, as someone who'd built his Minneapolis sound on the same funk foundation that Clyde had helped create, Prince recognized that without the funky drummer, hip-hop as we know it might not exist. Throughout the early 90s, Prince watched the sampling explosion with a mixture of fascination and horror. Fascination because he loved seeing funk DNA spread through new genres. Horror because he saw what was happening to the originators. James Brown was fighting costly legal battles. George Clinton was broke despite Parliament Funkadelic's massive influence. And Clyde Stubblefield, the man whose beat literally powered the golden age of hip-hop, was working as a part-time musician in a city far from any major music scene. But Prince didn't speak about it publicly. That wasn't his way. Instead, he filed the information away in that remarkable mind of his, the one that remembered every slight, every debt, every karmic imbalance in the music industry. He watched. He waited. And when the moment came, he acted. The year 2000 arrived with devastating news for the Stubblefield household. Clyde, now 65, had bladder cancer. Advanced, aggressive. The kind that requires immediate, expensive, relentless treatment. He had no health insurance. Medicare wouldn't cover everything. The medical bills started arriving like storm clouds, each one darker than the last. $90,000 for the first round of treatments. Then more still. Jody watched her husband, the strongest man she'd ever known, begin to crumble under the weight of impossible math. They held a benefit concert. The Madison music community rallied, raising about $5,000. It was beautiful. It was generous. It wasn't nearly enough. Local newspapers ran stories about the man who changed music history, now facing death because he couldn't afford to live. The irony was crushing. His drums had soundtracked a generation's revolution, but when he needed help, the revolution was nowhere to be found. Clyde never complained. That wasn't his nature. He'd grown up in Chattanooga, Tennessee, in a time and place where black musicians were expected to be grateful for any opportunity at all. He'd played with James Brown through the 60s and 70s, watching the godfather of soul become wealthy while his band stayed poor. He'd seen the music industry chew up and spit out dozens of talented people. This was just how things worked. Genius without ownership was just labor. Influence without contracts was just history. But someone 1,500 miles away in Minnesota was paying attention. Someone who'd read those newspaper articles. Someone who understood exactly what was happening because he'd spent decades fighting the same system that was now letting Clyde die. Prince's approach to charity was unusual. Most celebrities announce their giving. They hold galas, cut oversized checks for cameras, bask in the glow of public gratitude. Prince did the opposite. His Jehovah's Witness faith taught him that charity done for recognition wasn't really charity at all. True giving happened in silence, between the giver, the receiver, and God. Nothing else mattered. No press releases, no photo opportunities, no quid pro quo. Throughout the late 90s and early 2000s, Prince had been quietly funding dozens of causes. A struggling school in North Minneapolis, cancer treatment for a former musician in New Orleans, housing assistance for families in crisis. He moved through the world like a purple ghost, leaving checks and changed lives in his wake, never staying long enough to accept thanks. His accountants knew, his lawyers knew, and everyone was sworn to absolute silence. When Prince learned about Clyde's situation, something clicked. This wasn't just another charitable cause. This was personal. This was about funk, about rhythm, about the invisible threads connecting one generation of black musicians to another. This was about the debt the music industry owed to its architects. Prince had built Paisley Park on a foundation of funk. He'd studied James Brown, George Clinton, Sly Stone, and yes, Clyde Stubblefield. Every drum pattern he programmed, every rhythm he constructed, carried the DNA of the funky drummer. If anyone understood what Clyde had given to music, it was Prince. The instructions to his financial team were clear. Find out exactly what Clyde needed, cover it completely, and ensure absolute anonymity. No trails, no records that could be traced back. Nothing that would turn this into a publicity story. Just help. Pure, uncomplicated, generous help. When that cashier's check arrived in the Stubblefield kitchen, Jody's first reaction was disbelief. Then fear. Was this real? Was someone playing a cruel joke? She called the bank. They confirmed the check was legitimate. The funds were real, available immediately. Enough to cover not just the current medical bills, but the ongoing treatment Clyde would need for years. Jody cried. Then she got angry. Who does this? What kind of person saves someone's life and doesn't even want to be acknowledged? She needed to know, needed to thank them, needed to understand why they cared when the rest of the industry had moved on. She started calling everyone she could think of. Music journalists who'd covered Clyde's story, lawyers who specialized in music rights, even some of the famous producers who'd sampled The Funky Drummer. Nobody knew anything, or if they did, they weren't talking. The mystery consumed her for months. She'd lie awake at night, running through possibilities. Maybe it was someone Clyde had mentored years ago. Maybe a wealthy producer who'd made millions off the break and finally felt guilty. Maybe James Brown himself, though that seemed unlikely given their complicated history. Every theory led nowhere. The benefactor had covered their tracks with professional precision. Clyde took a different approach. He accepted the gift with quiet gratitude and focused on getting better. The treatments were brutal. Chemotherapy that left him weak and sick. Surgeries that tested the limits of his endurance. But now he could afford the best care. He could focus on healing instead of worrying about bankruptcy. Whoever had done this had given him something more valuable than money. They'd given him peace. As Clyde recovered through 2001 and 2002, something else was happening in the music world. The sampling lawsuit era was reaching its peak. High-profile cases were establishing new precedents about digital rights and interpolation. Artists who'd been sampled were finally starting to see some compensation, though it was often too little, too late. Clyde himself eventually received a small settlement from one record label, though it didn't come close to reflecting the true value of his contribution. Prince watched all of this from Paisley Park with a mixture of satisfaction and frustration. Satisfaction that the conversation was finally happening. Frustration that it had taken so long, that so many pioneers had died poor while lawyers got rich arguing about their legacies. He'd been fighting similar battles his entire career, writing slave on his face, changing his name to an unpronounceable symbol. Anything to draw attention to the industry's fundamental injustice. The people who create the art rarely own the art. But Prince never connected himself publicly to Clyde's recovery. When journalists asked him about sampling and artist rights, he'd talk about the broader issues without mentioning specific cases. When friends brought up Clyde's miraculous anonymous benefactor, Prince would smile that enigmatic smile and change the subject. The secret was safe. The debt had been repaid. That was all that mattered. The years passed. Clyde's cancer went into remission, then came back, then went into remission again. He continued playing, teaching drum students, talking to music historians about the golden age of funk. He never forgot that anonymous check. In interviews, he'd mention it with a kind of reverent mystery, calling it a miracle, a blessing from God, proof that someone out there understood what he'd given to music. Prince followed Clyde's recovery from a distance, the way a guardian angel might watch over someone they'd saved. There was no direct contact, no secret meetings, just the satisfaction of knowing he'd done something right, something pure, something that honored the funk tradition they both served. In 2006, Clyde's cancer returned more aggressively. This time, multiple anonymous donations arrived. Not just one benefactor now, but several. Prince's initial act of generosity had inspired others, creating a network of silent supporters who made sure Clyde could focus on fighting instead of fundraising. The Madison music community organized more benefit concerts. National music magazines ran feature stories celebrating Clyde's influence. He was finally getting recognition, though it came wrapped in the reality of his mortality. It wasn't until after Prince's death in 2016 that the full story began to surface. Financial records released during the estate settlement revealed dozens of anonymous charitable contributions. Musicians came forward with stories of receiving mysterious help during difficult times. A pattern emerged. Prince had been operating as a one-man safety net for struggling artists, especially funk and soul pioneers who'd been exploited by the industry. Clyde's name appeared in those records, not with full details, but enough to confirm what some had suspected for years. Prince had been the phantom benefactor, the purple shadow that had passed over the Stubblefield household in their darkest hour, the debt payer who understood that genius deserves more than historical footnotes. When Jody learned the truth, she wept. Clyde had died in 2017, just 1 year after Prince, never knowing for certain who had saved him. But Jody knew, and she understood why Prince had insisted on secrecy. This wasn't about ego or recognition. This was about funk royalty taking care of funk royalty. This was about one revolutionary artist honoring another. This was about the invisible bonds that connect those who truly understand what it means to change music. The story of Prince and Clyde Stubblefield reveals something profound about artistic debt and moral responsibility. In an industry built on exploitation, where the architects of genres often die poor while corporations profit from their innovation, Prince chose to be different. He didn't just talk about injustice, he acted. He used his wealth and influence to quietly correct imbalances, to honor debts the industry pretended didn't exist. Clyde Stubblefield's 7-second drum break generated an estimated $300 million in revenue across thousands of songs. He received almost none of it during his lifetime. That's the music industry's truth, ugly and undeniable. But Prince's anonymous intervention represents another truth, that some artists see beyond competition and ego to recognize their fundamental interconnection. Without Clyde's drums, there might be no hip-hop. Without hip-hop, Prince's later experimental work might not exist. The debt was real, and Prince paid it. Today, music sampling laws have evolved. Artists receive more protection, more compensation, more recognition for their contributions. It's imperfect, still unequal, still frustrating. But it's better than it was in 2000 when Clyde faced cancer with empty pockets. And a small part of that progress came from silent moments, like the one Prince created. Moments when artists took care of each other because institutions wouldn't. Listen to any hip-hop playlist today and you'll hear Clyde Stubblefield. His ghost lives in every programmed drum pattern, every breakbeat, every rhythmic foundation that drives modern music forward. Producers who've never heard of him still unconsciously emulate patterns he established. His influence is so fundamental it's become invisible, like gravity or air, something you don't notice until it's gone. Prince understood that kind of influence. He'd created his own gravitational field, bending music toward his vision of what funk, rock, and soul could be. He knew what it meant to be sampled, borrowed from, emulated by thousands of artists who might never acknowledge the source. He knew the strange immortality of being everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. And so when he had the chance to help the man who'd helped create the template for modern rhythm, Prince didn't hesitate. He didn't calculate publicity value or tax deductions or strategic advantage. He simply helped because it was right. Because Clyde deserved it. Because funk takes care of funk. Because some debts transcend money and contracts and legal systems. The envelope that arrived in Madison that Tuesday morning wasn't just a check. It was a message from one generation of musical revolutionaries to another. It said, "I see you. I value you. Your contribution matters. You won't be forgotten. You won't die poor and afraid. Not on my watch." That's the real legacy of Prince and Clyde Stubblefield. Not just the music they created individually, but the invisible thread of mutual respect and support that connected them across time and space. In an industry that often treats artists as disposable, they prove that some bonds run deeper than business. Some debts get repaid in silence. Some heroes save other heroes without ever needing credit. And somewhere in that space between the beats, in the pause between the rhythm and the response, you can still hear both of them. Clyde's drums powering the groove, Prince's bass adding the melody. Two masters of funk, separated by decades and styles, united by understanding. One visible in his influence, the other invisible in his generosity. Both essential, both immortal, both proving that true greatness isn't just about what you create, but about who you lift up when no one's watching. The funky drummer played on, and the man in purple made sure he could.